Hello, my dear students. Hope you're fine. Today I'm here to teach your fifth week's biology lesson under unit number 5, lesson number 5.5. Today's lesson is fertilization of. Dear students, before we start today's lesson, it's better to do a small recap. Let's see what you have learned so far. You learned plant reproduction can happen in two ways, as sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. When we talk more about sexual reproduction, you learnt about the flower, that is the reproductive unit of some plants. You have learnt the main parts of a flower and their functions. Next you learnt a special process called pollination. There are two types of pollination, as self-pollination and cross-pollination. Lastly, you have learnt about different flowers which show different adaptations for pollination. With these things, let's move on for today's lesson. Before further explanations, let me show you something. This is a papaya flower and this is a small papaya fruit. How do these flowers become fruits? To find the answer for this, let's learn some more. This will give you a small clue about our today's lesson. Now let's see what exactly happens after pollination. Yes, the next and the most important process is fertilization. So, what is fertilization? How does it happen? You may get all these questions into your minds. Let me explain. Fertilization means the fusion of the nuclei of male and female gametes to form a zygote. I'll repeat. Fertilization means the fusion of the nuclei of male and female gametes to form a zygote. Dear students, this is the definition of fertilization. So you can write it down in your writing books. As you can see, there are some new terms in this definition. To continue with the lesson, let's understand the meanings of these new terms like gametes, fusion, and zygote. Children, now what is a zygote? It's a single cell structure formed from the fusion of male and female gametes. Also, it's called as a fertilized egg. When we talk about plants, this zygote will become a new plant one day. Or you can tell zygote is the result of fertilization. After the fusion of male and female gametes, zygote is the result of fertilization. I hope now you can understand the definition of fertilization properly. Let's move further to understand how it happens and what are the steps of it and where it is happening inside a plant. My dear children, in plants, male gamete is inside the pollen grain. In the ovary, there are ovules, each containing a female gamete. Now look at the two pictures given here. First picture, actually it's an electron microscopic view of a pollen grain. In the second picture, I have pointed the ovules which are there inside the ovary. What are gametes? Simply, they are the reproductive cells of an organism. As you know, children, organisms need to reproduce for the continuation of their species. You have learnt earlier, for the sexual reproduction, these specialized cells or gametes are needed. These gametes are made from a male and also from a female. When we relate this for plants, as that is our topic, male gametes are produced by the stamen of a flower. Stamen means the male reproductive part of a flower. The female gametes are produced by the carpel. Carpel means the female reproductive part of a flower. When these two gametes join, it will produce a zygote. My dear students, during the stage of pollination, matured pollen of a flower will get deposited on the stigma of the flower of the same species. I hope you know that. Then after that, when a pollen grain is deposited on the stigma, it is stimulated by the sugar solution on the stigma and germinates. This is what you can see in the given picture. A pollen tube begins to grow. Now see the next picture, my dear students. The pollen tube grows through the style until it reaches an ovule inside the ovary. Now you can see the pollen tube has grown up to the ovule through the style. The pollen tube enters through the micropyle into the ovule. My dear students, what is the meaning of this term micropyle? It is the small opening in the surface of an ovule through which the pollen tube penetrates. Now the male gamete travels along the pollen tube into the ovule. Male gamete fuses with the female gamete and fertilization has now taken place. My dear students, now let's move on to an important diagram which you must know to label. This diagram is given in your textbook, page number 22, as the figure number 1.25. You can take your biology books and a pencil to copy down and label the given parts. This is a diagram of the pistil at the stage of plant fertilization. My dear students, you can label the stigma, style, ovary and ovary wall in this diagram. I know you have learned them. Then try to identify the pollen grain which has deposited on the stigma. Of course, you can see it. Then you can label the pollen tube which has grown through the style and then the egg cell which is there inside the ovule. Then as I have shown in the picture, you can label the nucleus of the pollen tube and then the nucleus of the egg cell. Now, my dear children, let's see how fertilization takes place. Pollen grains have reached the stigma of the flower. Pollen grain breaks, opens the wall of stigma and forms a pollen tube. Male gamete moves down the pollen tube. When the tip of the pollen tube reaches an ovule, the male gamete enters the ovule. It fuses with the female gamete in a process called fertilization, and zygote is produced. Okay children, now let's see what happens after fertilization. Okay, my dear students, let's learn what happens after fertilization. As you know, at the stage of fertilization, the new zygote has formed. After this process, this new zygote will develop to form an embryo. Actually, this zygote undergoes repeated cell divisions to form the embryo plant. Dear students, you may have seen many flowers and fruits. Can you remember the papaya flower and the fruit that I showed you at the beginning of this video? I hope you can. Any fruit you enjoy was at one time a flower. In the flower to fruit transformation, plants go through a cycle of pollination, fertilization, ripening, and eventual fruit maturity. My dear students, as I told you, the flower undergoes several changes after the fertilization. Let's try to understand this by using two sections. First, what happens in the ovary after fertilization, and then what will happen to the other flower parts. As you know, in the ovule, the zygote will be developing into an embryo. Later, it will form the root and the shoot, and also it will contain a food store. The outer part of the ovule is becoming a bit tough. That means it's forming a tough coat to become the seed. Then what happens to the ovary? Ovary begins to swell. You can see in the diagram, because the fruit develops from the ovary. Seeds will be developing inside the fruit. Then the fruit will grow bigger. Then children, what will happen to the other flower parts? The sepals, petals, stamens, they wither and fall off. My dear students, there's something to remember. I told you usually after fertilization, the sepals wither away. But not in all the plants. You may have seen tomatoes. Of course you do. There you have seen that sepals remain attached to the fruit. Fruit means the tomato. Not only tomatoes, raspberry, strawberry also can take as examples. Here's another diagram for you, my dear students, to understand the changes happen in a flower after fertilization. At the point number 1, you can see a flower just after fertilization. So, zygote is there inside the ovary. Number 2 shows that the zygote has developed into an embryo. Petals are withering. Number 3 shows the seeds development. Seeds have developed from the ovules, and you can't see colorful petals anymore. Number 4 shows the fruit is developing from the ovary. Number 5, shows the fruit ripens, flower parts have fallen away, seeds are there inside the fruit. Hope you can understand the stages which happen after fertilization and how the flower is changing into a fruit and how the seeds are formed inside the fruit. So my dear students, before I finish today's lesson, I thought of giving a small summary. If you can answer these questions, that means you have understood the lesson in a proper way. What happens after pollination? What is fertilization? Main stages of fertilization in plants. What is a zygote? What happens to the other flower parts after fertilization? What happens to the ovary and ovules after the fertilization? And children, there's an assignment to complete after watching this lesson. Thank you, my dear students. Hope you have learned the lesson properly. Stay safe. Bye for now.